When Pierce passed away, that for a long time felt like this is probably the end of the project. I didn't touch music for quite a while. I didn't know what I was going to do next creatively. I was kind of lost in a lot of ways. Months went by, and it wasn't until I was visiting the Fultons later that year that I decided I wanted to go through Pierce's computer and start looking for the pieces of the things that we had started working on after we had finished the first album. It kind of at that time felt like I was ready to see what pieces were left. And I started to realize that there were a lot of good pieces. There was like melodies and chord progressions and like field recordings that felt very nostalgic and meaningful. And I kind of got obsessed with collecting all these pieces and for the purposes of trying to see what I could do with them. Because a lot of these pieces were clearly Leaving Laurel, but they just weren't done. As I was collecting all these tiny pieces, I started to remember a conversation Pierce and I had around the time we were finishing the first album. He really had to convince me to put out the first album. I was ready to move on creatively from all the singles that we had put out, the EPs at the beginning of the project, and he had to convince me to make it an album. I was already ready to do something more sort of beyond the ceiling of our abilities at the time. I wanted to push ourselves a little harder. And you can kind of hear that compromise that we made sort of at the ending of some of the songs. On the first album, there's these ambient interludes and things where there's like more creative sections versus just dance music beat outros. And before that album came out, we were already talking about doing something more conceptual, something more planned out, something more like one larger collection of music that wasn't just a collection, but it was more like one cohesive idea. And yeah, so as I started to collect these things, I realized that there was something to start with. There was enough to begin that seeing that idea through. So instead of taking references from contemporary dance music, I looked to more things like John Hopkins and rival consoles. Those were things I was listening to a lot more at the time than dance music, and I wasn't really inspired by that. Even before Pierce had passed away, we were kind of already leaning into that, wanting to do something like that. But also a lot of things from my youth as well, I was drawing inspiration from. I listened to a lot of post-rock and have since I was a teenager, and bands like Bark Psychosis and Sigur Rós and Mogwai, they do a lot of these very extended songs that kind of go on these journeys with big crescendos and highs and lows. And I've always drawn comparison to that style of tension and release with a lot of dance music. And so that started to become a very important influence for the record, where the songs began to be arranged more so like a post-rock band, I guess, versus something that would be more functional for a DJ, I guess. So these small pieces of things started to connect, and I started to see connections between them. And as you hear on the album, there's lots of codas and pieces that turn into whole other sections and more movements, because they were all just tiny fragments of songs that I started to see through lines between them all. And at one point I started to realize I was working on 8 songs kind of simultaneously, or more so 8 tracks simultaneously. As they started taking shape, I was realizing that what I needed to do and how to finally get them to the final stretch, until one point I realized that there was nothing left to do. And so at that point, I had to sort of distance myself from the record because I was living inside of this sort of grieving process that kind of went on when the record was being made. And I needed to sort of step back and kind of let it sort of marinate, I guess, for a bit, because it was kind of weighing on me after a while, because it was so emotionally heavy to be living inside of the world of that music. And so when I came back to it, and hearing it again with sort of some time had passed, I realized that what this album was a metaphor for finding beauty in loss, finding new life in things that seemingly had already expired. It's a similar concept to the cover of the record. I worked with Ben Chadwick and Adam Marshall. I presented the concept of dried flowers as a metaphor, because they're like bouquets of dried flowers there are these beautiful arrangements from plants and flowers that have passed away. And so I felt that was a fitting visual for the record. And Adam Marshall had been scanning things that he had been finding these sort of, as you see, all these pieces of dried plants and flowers. And then Ben was taking these ideas and sort of arranging them with like digitally. And we kind of went back and forth on what we liked and what made sense and what looked good. And it really felt like an extension of what the record was. The record had been me taking these tiny pieces of music and seeing them through to the finish line and giving them new life, as I said. That felt like the same thing that we were doing with these flowers, and that sort of became what the visual of this record is. And When the Quiet Comes, as a title, came to me one day. It felt like the fitting expression of what this record was for a lot of reasons. I mean, just at face value, the record is more subdued and it feels very quiet, and especially the second half of it is more drawn out and more serene. But it kind of also means when the quiet comes, when the quiet moments you have to yourself, when there's no more distractions, and kind of that honest moment that you have with yourself and how that feels. That's different for everybody, and I think that was the space that I was living in a lot of the time that I was working on this record. Whereas it used to be collaborative, now it was me alone trying to find a way forward. And so it felt like the perfect title for the record. And I suppose the whole thing, if we look at it, is kind of summarized by one of the titles of the songs. From nothing came something, and it's gonna last a lifetime.